Hey, Truflation Nation, Stefan here, back again. Happy Monday. And I just quickly want to go into why we are putting Truflation on the blockchain and how that works and why that matters. Why am I sharing this with you? Basically, over the last sort of couple of weeks, I've been asked a lot of times by journalists, by investors, why do we need to put a SaaS business, which today is what it really is, onto the blockchain, and why is that so needed, right? And whilst technology is really important, and when we set out to build out Truflation, our whole focus was really leveraging modern systems, building building out Truflation with a developer mindset. What did that entail is basically tapping into APIs, trying to get the data and aggregate data from different formats, different sources, different time intervals into and building out composability associated with that data. What does that mean? Is to make sure that they're conform and compatible with each other as you aggregate and pull this together from over 160 plus different sources in multiple different formats for each of the items that we track. But either way, and we also, it is really important to make this available to everybody and anybody that wants to access this. So if you think about it, inflation information has largely been available only to people with Bloomberg terminals or accredited investors, which represent maybe 500 million of the worldwide population. That's leaving some 8.5 billion, yep, you heard me, billion people that don't have access to a lot of these financial and economic data. And so our goal was to try and help make that available to everybody. And whilst technology is important, because we need to be able to scale, we need to show independence, etc. We also and feel much more important that a transparent methodology is extremely, if not more important, than the actual technology itself. And ultimately, how do we provide that transparency? So blockchain, to a large extent, allows us to achieve all of this. Number one, it's modern. Number two, it's transparent. You can see all the transactions and the data that's on chain once it's written to the chain. It's immutable. We cannot go back and change it. And unlike governments, they go back and change the historical data. They go back 6 months' time and change their historical data that they reported. And of course, by that time, nobody really cares about it. So that's an important element. Censorship resistance. You can't shut this down. You can't close it. And I'll come to you why that's an important element. But if this data and these pricing feeds and this information is something that a government may not like, how do they shut it down? They may not like to have these numbers shared. Decentralized in itself. So it's maintained by multiple parties, giving it a level of independence associated with it. Ultimately, trustless as well. So I can trust the data because of its independence and permissionlessness. So anybody can upload the data as long as it's composable with the other data that's in there. And as I mentioned really early on, composability is applying to the data that's then plugged in and can conform, adapt, be consistent with the other data sets that are in there. As long as that's the case, anybody should be able to upload data and pricing information or economic and financial data to the Truflation decentralized independent network. And so those are important elements there. So that's really the summary of it. Censorship resistance, why? So if you look today, there's about $4.4 trillion worth of inflationary linked bonds. And so I'm just going to, and I'm not just bringing this out of the air. There's an article that was out there in Reuters that talks about surging inflation spurs demand for rare linker bonds, as they call it. TIPS, some people call it, linker bonds, which are inflationary linked bonds, right? And here you can read clearly that 4.4 trillion dollar market, right? And if you can see further down here in the article, it talks about revenue. So here they also talk about the US, and this is issued, by the way, by governments, both in the US, in Europe, but also by private enterprises, right? And you can see when the US first created TIPS, right, in 1997, inflation was above 2%. Now it's running at 7%. This was a while back. In our case, in the UK, it was nearly up at 20%. In other markets, it was about 12, 13%, right? And then you can see roughly 7.8 excuse me, and it goes into the breakdown, so I can share this article with you if you like, but that's just an insight in terms of one of the elements, right? So if you think about that, that is the size of the market, right? And ultimately, if an alternative source of truth is becoming that source of information in terms of how these $4.4 trillion are tied to Truflation or any other source of truth, then that could become a bit of a threat for an existing government that they might want to censor it. Also, you're seeing censorship, right? So I talked about censorship resistant. Why is that important, right? You can see in China, right? So China had very high inflation numbers associated with joblessness. So a number of independent youth were not finding a job. So these numbers started hitting record highs. And all of a sudden, the government, number one, they tried to spin this data in an interesting way. Number two is, as a next step, they then try to sort of tweak the numbers or the methodology in a specific way, right? And interpret the data in a positive light. And if that doesn't work, they edit the data and they change the methodology, which we've seen in the US at the early beginning of this year, where they changed the whole methodology. Or perhaps they stop publishing completely. They just cancel it. And that's what happened in China. They decided to not publish this report anymore and not go into it anymore. So you can see a lot of different things happening around censorship resistance and the activity there. And so it's really important that we stay free and open to everybody. Immutable, transparent, accessible. I shared with you why already, right? So writing it to the blockchain ensures transparency, accessible, immutability. So we already have all of those elements there by just using it on the blockchain. And by the way, anybody that wants to access the data has access to this decentralized network where everybody can play into it. One benefit that nobody really talks about is the cost. Right? There's a significant cost advantage launching this business, mainly out of the fact that everybody that has a vested interest in this ecosystem is willing to take and be paid in part ownership of this ecosystem. And that is in the form of tokens. Over time, you can argue it's going to be very costly, but over the early stages of a business, you're giving away a lot of tokens so that the community also contributes to the evolution of this protocol. And that is important, right? If you look at it, usually centralized entities are run by centralized leaderships that go to VCs, raise hundreds of millions of dollars for a SaaS business, and use those dollars for advertising, for customer acquisition costs, and as well as paying a lot of money to significant developers and engineers, as well as marketeers and business developers to help, and accountants and lawyers to spend that money on it. In this case, it's decentralized. Everybody has ownership on it, and you do not need to spend millions and billions of dollars in lawyers, accountants, regulation, licensing, etc. You need to comply. You need to put it all onto the blockchain, and you need the community to help develop this protocol that has utility as well as has ownership in the tokens. And so that can be done at a far more cost-effective basis in terms of on a dollar basis. And lastly, governance. So governance really matters, as I talked about, around the methodology. So you can protect the methodology, and I can't just change it at a whim like you would see in most governments. And so those are elements that are really important around this. The blockchain enables that because everybody has a vested interest. It's fully transparent. You can see who has the tokens, how they contribute to the results. A lot of people using the protocol and the feeds that are coming from the protocol have a vested interest in seeing that that methodology stays stable. And because it stays stable, they then can build out credibility, trust, reliability associated with it, and also have a vested interest in ensuring that that is the case. And so those are elements that we believe are a significant added value and a necessity to establish why Truflation needs to be on the blockchain. Number one, it is modern. It's a modern solution. It is censorship resistant, number 2. Number 3, it's immutable, transparent, and accessible to anybody. Number 4, it's costly, and cost benefits far outweigh that of traditional centralized systems, and the governance associated with the methodology to ensure accurate methodology, transparent methodology. Those are the main reasons why Truflation is moving towards decentralizing and bringing Truflation to the blockchain. Thank you.